Okay, today is going to be one of the longer videos. We've got a pretty important and complex subject to tackle that we're going to try and do with this video as we talk about how we got the Bible. And especially the Old Testament is what we're talking about today. How did we get the Old Testament? We won't go into everything we could with this topic, but there are a number of things that it's really important for you to understand. If we are going to appreciate our scriptures, we really should understand how we got them and appreciate how we got them. The first question really to ask is, well, even before we ask that question, let's make sure we appreciate this. From 2 Nephi 29, the Gentiles shall have a Bible, and it shall proceed forth from the Jews, mine ancient covenant people. And what think they, the Jews, for the Bible which they receive from them? Yea, what do the Gentiles mean? Do they remember the travails and the labors and the pains of the Jews, and their diligence unto me, in bringing forth the salvation unto the Gentiles? That's what we want to do. We want to make sure we appreciate and understand the travails and the work that went into bringing forth the Bible. So, I'm going to silence my phone. In order to really understand this, let's kind of look at, and I'm going to just do this for a minute. I want to write on here, at what the Hebrew Bible consists of. In Hebrew, it's called the Tanakh, and that comes from the consonants, the T, the N, and the Ch. That stands for, why am I not getting this here? Alright, that stands for the Torah, which is the law, or the first 5 books of Moses. And then we have the Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophet. Those are the prophetic books, you know, that we have the major prophets and the minor prophets, which isn't about their importance, but it's about the size of their writings. So major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, those that have these substantive books. And the minor prophets are the smaller books like Zechariah and Obadiah and Haggai and so on. So you have the prophetic writings, and we'll talk about these as we go along as well. And then you have the Ketuvim, which is the Hebrew word for writings. And literally this just means the writings. They're historical and they're poetic writings and these kinds of things. So you have the historical writings, which are, say, Joshua through 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And then you have more poetic writings like Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, these kinds of things. So those are the writings, and we have them in a slightly different order than they do in the Hebrew Bible, but it's basically the same way with those same groupings. That's how your Bible is grouped, is not necessarily chronologically, but according to this order, the law, the prophets, and the writings. So now we come to the question of how did they get written down? That's the first question we need to ask. How did we get anything written at all? And it's not as simple as you would think, because for most of the history of the Old Testament, people are largely illiterate. There's not a lot of writing, and certainly not much reading at all. And so when the prophecies first come, for the most part, they come orally. So let's see here. Why is this not clicking? All right. So for the most part, they come orally. Here's the famous picture of Noah. The idea that he is preaching, or typically when we think of the prophets, we think of them preaching, not writing very much. And it's not for a little while that we will get into writing prophets. Hi. In any case, prophecies were first spoken for the most part, or stories were first spoken. In fact, we don't get really writing prophets until much later. So what we have, for the most part, for the first part of the Bible, are stories. You'll notice that up until Isaiah's day, it's all story, story, story. And these are probably stories that were passed down orally. And people learned them and passed them on. The 5 books of Moses that were traditionally written by Moses, and I don't know how much was and how much was not, certainly at least not the end, because his death and a little bit after his death is recorded in there. And maybe the version we have, very little of it was written by Moses. I don't know, but my guess is quite a bit is. Those were probably written down at some point. Whether what we have is what he wrote or is a different version of that, or an oral version of that, or something. I don't know. Certainly the Book of Moses, as we know, contains some real differences from the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah as it's known, which means the law. Certainly has some differences from that. And then we just have story after story after story recorded of Elijah and Elisha and so on, who we don't think wrote and may have been completely illiterate, but stories about them were passed on that eventually end up being written down. So, I'm having a hard time getting this to click forward. There we go. We don't want that. Oh yeah, so here's how things work for an oral society. In Deuteronomy, when they want to teach their children, they say, "Keep these words that I am commanding you this day in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away." That's the way you teach things in an orally oriented society, and that's clearly what they had, and the Lord was working with them in that society since they weren't very literate. And so things keep going that way. Just to contrast, to give you an idea of that difference, here we have a drawing of Adam, who we knew could write, but what happens to that ability to write during the flood or something? I don't know. If it's completely lost and they had to start over, I don't know. And his records, Abraham seems to have access to them, but they seem to get lost at some point. But there's Adam, who has certainly some writing. This is Lehi reading the brass plates. But have you ever stopped to think about this? Lehi didn't own a set of scriptures. He had to go get them from somewhere else. He's a prophet, and he knows the scriptures well, but he doesn't own a set of scriptures. He must have learned these going to synagogue or something similar to synagogue and having them passed down to him. So that's kind of the model, although Lehi's day, the model is in the process of changing. Right? Lehi will preach orally, but he will end up writing some things down, and his son will certainly end up writing, and they're part of this era where we really move to a writing day. So let's talk about watershed eras. One of these eras is Hezekiah's day. In fact, my guess would be that most, if almost all, not quite all, but most of Joshua through 2 Kings is written in Hezekiah's day. Who it's written by, I don't know. There's got to be a group of redactors or scribes, someone who are akin to the Mormon of the Book of Mormon. One person or a group of people who assemble whatever records they have, whatever oral stories they have, and start writing this stuff down. Maybe they have a number of these things are written. Maybe they have most of the Torah or all of the Torah. Maybe they have stuff that Joshua wrote, and maybe Joshua didn't write anything. But whatever they have, they gather, they use it, they use what the oral traditions they have, they use the records of the court, and they start to write things down. And I suspect, from just a few little clues in 2 Kings, that much of that happened during Hezekiah's day, which is the era that we first see writing as an emphasis begin. All right? It's not a coincidence that this is also Isaiah's day, and Isaiah is the first of what we call the writing prophets, prophets who actually wrote. So if you look at this list of books of the Bible, and you can see all these stories that I was just talking about, Genesis through 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah will be written later, and Esther and so on. But when we get to the prophets, here you can see all of the prophets, and what we call the prophets. These aren't all of the prophets, these are all of the prophetic books. Guess how many of these are written from Isaiah's day and on? All of them. Right? Isaiah is contemporary with Hosea and so on. But that's when we first get prophets who are writing things down. As I said, Elijah and Elisha don't write things down, or if they did, they're lost, but I think they didn't write things down. At about Hezekiah's day, there's a change worldwide with an emphasis on writing being made, and that is when we will first start to get prophets who will write things down. Now, whether Isaiah writes his prophecies himself, or whether he speaks them and they're passed on and eventually someone else writes them, or whether it's some combination of those things, we don't know. My guess is Isaiah does a lot of writing himself, maybe all of it himself, but it's a little hard to tell. Another watershed era is the days of Josiah, and this has got to be when Lehi was a little boy and Jeremiah was a little boy. And during Josiah, I suspect that is when writing certainly worldwide takes kind of a step forward, and the emphasis on writing and trying to get everything put into writing. There are some little clues in the Bible that make me think that this is when 2 Kings was ended, was during Josiah's day. Then, of course, when Ezra and Nehemiah happened and so on, these will get finished, written in their day or shortly thereafter or something along those lines. But this is one of those watershed events. Especially, as I said, Jeremiah is from just after Josiah's day, and has some, probably the most interesting thing to say about how his book is recorded. He's the only prophet for whom we know how his book was recorded, because he was told, take thee a roll of a book and write therein all the words that I have spoken unto thee against Israel and against Judah and against all the nations from the day I spake unto thee from the days of Josiah even unto this day. Then Jeremiah called Baruch the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord which he had spoken unto him upon a roll of a book. So we know that there was a scribe who took what Jeremiah said and wrote them down. That's how we get the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah himself doesn't seem to write them. Jeremiah speaks these prophecies, and Baruch wrote them. It may be that Isaiah had done the same thing, and maybe Ezekiel, or maybe they write them themselves. In the end, we really don't know. Jeremiah is the only one that we know this about. All right? So that takes us to something like this. We know that God reveals things to prophets. What this chart should have is in here is the prophet, all right, and the prophet speaking. It's not considered the things we're talking about, the people who made this chart. Instead, they go to what we call the prophet autograph, meaning that which was written by the prophet himself or by his scribe. And some of these books may have been passed down orally, and the scribe is generations removed. We don't know, but probably for most of these prophetic writings, they're from the time period of writing these things down. So we probably get an autograph by a scribe, my guess would be in most cases. But anyway, God reveals these, the prophet speaks them, and they get written by the prophet or a scribe or someone else. And then someone makes a copy of that, and someone makes a copy of that, and you get copy after copy after copy after copy, and then eventually someone will translate them into various languages, and eventually those are translated into English, and you and I end up with them. So that's the process, and we want to talk about the transcription or transmission process. So once these things are written, they are then copied again and again and again. And because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know a little bit more about this process than we used to, and we find out that it was a little bit fluid, right? So that you'll get these manuscripts where someone writes something above the line, or the dots mean cross out what's below it. They'll write things in the margins. Some of these are them correcting things they realize they made a mistake, but sometimes it's a scribe who makes a comment, such as here, a scribe makes a comment, and then the next person who copies that same manuscript doesn't take it as a comment, he takes it as part of the text and he just puts it in the text. So that what we have by the time this it all gets done is a whole bunch of text where there are additions and deletions that may or may not be from inspired people and may or may not belong there. And as Latter-day Saints, we know and understand that. We understand there are some problems with the translation, or by that Joseph Smith often means the transmission of the Bible, and we get that. So you can see here in this copy of the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, all these little additions all over the place. All right. Eventually, so it's a very fluid time period for quite a while. Eventually, the idea springs up that they should not change the text, and this is textual transmission and preserving the text is done by one group above all of others. They're not the only one that does it, but the ones that are most important are the Massarites. The Massarites are a group of people who receive biblical texts, and there's a whole long process between choosing what writings they have are canonical and what are not, what are prophetic, what are not. And different people, so for instance, some people seem to not think Esther was, others seem to think it was. Song of Solomon, yes or no. And so we eventually get, and we don't even know the process by which these books are chosen as the books that are inspired, but that happens, and they're passed on. And then you get the Massarites that receive these texts, and they want to preserve them exactly and precisely. And they have a number of ways of doing this. They will not change the text even when they know that there's a mistake or something that should be changed. And they're so serious about it, as they copy these to make sure it happens exactly the way it should. They know how many letters and words are in each verse, in each chapter, in each book, and in the Torah as a whole. They know what is the central letter, word, verse in each verse, chapter, book in the Torah as a whole, and how many aleph there are, how many bets there are, how many gimels there are, those are the letters. They count all of these things backwards and forwards all over the place just to make sure that they have done this precisely the way they received it. When we talk about when the Lord talks about the pains of the Jews, think of the work that they go through to give this to us. Now, when they think that there is something that's wrong, they put it in the notes. They won't change the text, but they put in the notes, well, some manuscripts read this way, others read a different way. We think it should be pronounced this way, or perhaps it should have been read a different way. And so they put these notes in the text itself rather than changing the text. And it is the Masoretic text that is the really the source that is used to give us our English translations. So we're going to look at this chart. We're not going to worry about the New Testament versions. We're looking here at the Hebrew Bible, all right? And the Hebrew Bible, it's translated into a couple of things, but the big story is that eventually it ends up with the Massarites, who take care of it, and they create this Masoretic text that is passed on for generations until we get the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Tanakh, that we then translate into our Bible, or our Old Testament, from the Hebrew. And that's really a very, very brief version, but a story of how we got the Old Testament.